What makes a comic a masterpiece? To try and answer that question, I want to look at one of the most beloved contemporary comic series in the world, Vinland Saga. If you've read Vinland Saga, you've probably noticed that it has an almost supernatural ability to engross you in its story and its world. But I want to find out, how does it do that? What's going on here beneath the surface? Well, after reading and rereading the series, analyzing my favorite passages, and reading every interview I could find with its author, I've identified 5 specific techniques that I think make Vinland Saga so special. So, whether you've never heard of Vinland Saga or you've read it a dozen times, I hope you join me to take it apart in this new series I'm calling Comic Genius. At its core, Vinland Saga is the story of Thorfinn, a young boy who is captured by the Vikings who killed his father as he trains to grow stronger and avenge his father's death. And while that may sound like it's just going to be Naruto with Vikings, hold on, because Vinland Saga's story has many layers, most of which don't reveal themselves right away. Now, I'm saving any major spoilers for the end of this video, and I'll give you a good warning beforehand, but I think it's fair to say that the overall thrust of Vinland Saga is much more than a quest for revenge. The biggest clue is right there in the title. Vinland Saga is named for the Vinland Sagas, 2 ancient Icelandic tales that tell of the Vikings' journey to North America around the year 1000. These sagas were given extra credibility in 1960 when the archaeological remains of a Norse settlement were discovered in Newfoundland and Canada. And while the story of Vinland Saga is heavily researched and the characters are loosely based on real people, this is very much a work of fiction. Author Makoto Yukimura himself describes it as 8 lies and 2 truths. It all spins out of Yukimura's curiosity about the question at the heart of the Vinland Sagas. What would cause a Viking to leave their existence to settle a land on the far side of the Atlantic Ocean? So, while Thorfinn's quest for revenge brings us into the story, this becomes only the doorway to a much grander tale of Vikings, of political strife and massive battles, often much larger than Thorfinn's own quest, but at the same time related. In fact, the design of the narrative structure is a key part of what makes this comic so special, but I'm gonna have to save that for the spoilery part of this video because there's really no other way to talk about it. But don't worry, we've got lots to talk about before then. Before we get to that, let's take a minute to meet Makoto Yukimura, because he's a fascinating guy and actually a surprising person to take on a Viking epic. See, Yukimura's obsession from the time he was young was science fiction. While he was never a good student, he was a voracious reader of science fiction, both in prose and manga, even though he had no intention of becoming a manga artist. He cites works like Fist of the North Star and the cyberpunk series Battle Angel Alita, along with Mobile Police Patlabor, as works that really excited him. But he was particularly drawn to hard science fiction series like Yukinobu Hoshino's 2001 Nights, a collection of heavily researched short stories, each of which are based on real scientific principles. But despite his love for science fiction and manga, even by the time he finished high school, he still wasn't considering it as a career, and decided to go to art school to study painting. But in college, the manga bug didn't leave him. He was a big fan of Keiji Kawaguchi's The Silent Service, a series about a rogue nuclear submarine that was being serialized in a weekly morning magazine. And when he read that Kawaguchi was looking for an assistant, he applied right away on impulse. Kawaguchi didn't end up selecting him, but he did pass his application on to another weekly morning artist, Shin Morimura, who liked Yukimura's work and offered him a job as an assistant for his series Thinking Dog. Yukimura agreed to put his studies on hold for a bit and try working on Thinking Dog. While Yukimura went in feeling confident, his confidence was quickly crushed. He realized he couldn't draw one line as well as Morimura did. He spent every night of his first month on the job riding his bike home crying, feeling guilty that Morimura was paying him despite his inability to contribute anything to the series. But Morimura had once worked for Katsuhiro Otomo, author of Akira and one of the greatest manga artists ever. When Morimura himself was dejected about his own contributions as Otomo's assistant, Otomo brought him drawings he had done early in his career to show Morimura how bad he was when he started out. So, just as Otomo was patient with Morimura, Morimura was patient with Yukimura. Gradually, Yukimura improved and soon ended up dropping out of art school to devote himself entirely to Talking Dog. After a while, word got back to one of the editors at Morning Magazine about Morimura's talented and strange assistant, who was at that time developing a timeline of the future of the universe, mapping out events that would happen 10, 20, 50 years in the future. He had never lost that obsession with hard science fiction, and the editor suggested he try turning his timeline into a manga. He wrote the script for what became Planates, a realistic story of the crew of a spacecraft who were responsible for cleaning up space debris, and the editor liked it. Now, Yukimura just had to draw it. While it took Morimura only 4 days to draw a chapter of Thinking Dog, it took Yukimura a full year to draw the first chapter of Planates. Morning agreed to publish that debut chapter of Planates. It was the first manga that Yukimura had ever drawn, and at 22 years old, he was finally a professional manga artist. But Yukimura, in what is kind of a theme here, is not fast. Planates was serialized irregularly as Yukimura struggled to turn in chapters on time. He wasn't lazy, just really particular. For instance, he threw away an entire episode because after doing his own orbital calculations, he realized the plot he had come up with wouldn't be realistic. His editors might not understand him, but Yukimura knew that his fellow science fiction fans demanded that kind of rigor. But after only a volume of Planates, Yukimura came to his editor with an idea. He wanted to do a manga about Vikings. His editor's response? Don't mess with me. The idea was shelved. But the idea didn't go away for Yukimura. Even as he serialized Planates, the Viking idea was in the back of his mind. Finally, in 2005, at 29 years old, Yukimura finished Planates and began work on his Viking tale. It was picked up by Weekly Shonen magazine, but unsurprisingly, Yukimura could not keep up with the weekly pace, and after 16 chapters, it was moved to a monthly magazine, Afternoon. Interestingly, the target audience for Afternoon was older than Weekly Shonen, and I do think that helps explain some of the shift in tone that happens early on in the series, but we'll get to that. So how does this hardcore science fiction guy go about making one of the greatest historical comics ever? Let's get into his techniques. It's probably obvious to you at this point that Yukimura was very dedicated to research and fidelity in his science fiction work, and that carries over to Vinland Saga. When you read it, it's hard to escape the feeling that you're being transported to a real place. How does Yukimura achieve this? Well, let's start with a quote. I actually did visit the places that became the setting of my story, such as Denmark, Iceland, Norway, France, and England. Whenever I visited them, I tried to use all of my senses, such as, is this a warm place? Is it a cold place? How does the wind feel? How cold is the water? So those feelings, the sensations that I experienced at those places, would give me the details to write the stories about those places. Sure, comics are a visual medium, but Yukimura realizes, just as great novelists do, that great works of fiction engage every one of our senses to bring us into their world. So let's look at some examples of how he does this. Generally, when we think of entering a new location or scene, comics often borrow from film grammar and show us an establishing shot, a wide-angle look at the location and its surroundings. But Yukimura rarely leans on establishing shots to set up his scenes. Instead, he builds up his environment with a succession of small details. If he wants to put us in a cabin, instead of showing us that cabin from the outside, he'll open with a close-up of a fire, with sound effects of pop and snap. Right away, we're feeling the warmth of that fire, hearing its sound as the background noise to this scene. Here, he precedes his establishing shot with water splashing against the rocks, letting us hear the waves and feel the sea breeze. The next time that we get a similar establishing shot, he leads it with the sound of hundreds of seagulls. This is a constant throughout the series. If we're in forest, there's the hooting of an owl and the sound of a waterfall. On a ship, we open with oars splashing into the water. Even when he does open with an establishing shot, he'll give you sensations. He draws in a way to make you feel the cold outside. Then you come inside, he fills your nose with smoke and your ears with the hiss of a pipe before warming you by the fire and allowing Leif Erikson to tell you his tale. Of course, Yukimura doesn't just use these sensory techniques to build the physical world, but for conjuring up the Viking horde itself. When you're marching with the army, and there's a lot of marching with armies, we don't just see a mass of marching soldiers, but we hear their boots slopping in the mud. We feel the icy winds pulling at their cloaks. He wants you to feel how bitter and unpleasant this world is. And in this way, this is all just setting the stage for his epic battles. And we're going to get to those battles, but before we do, I want to take a closer look at one more page, because it encapsulates so much of this whole series in microcosm. Yukimura opens with a long, tranquil view of the landscape. Now, the next panel doesn't show us a disturbance, but instead shows us the reaction to a disturbance, and very specifically, nature's reaction to this disturbance. And then he builds up the army by their sound. The sound of boots marching, the rattle of their weaponry. Finally, the tranquil panel at the top is paralleled with the final reveal of the soldiers, who stand still at attention, having fully defiled the natural world. Yukimura has built us a world, brought armies into it, and now he's about to unleash devastation. This is a Viking historical manga, so you know there are going to be big battles, but creating a great battle that's easy to follow, engaging, and surprising is no small feat. While some artists might just draw a splash page full of soldiers and call it a day, Yukimura once again uses a variety of techniques to give us not the depiction of a battle, but the sensation of battle itself. The best way to see this is in practice, so let's break down a few pages from the very first chapter. We'll start here, where the commander of the opposing army is freaking out. Now, once again, Yukimura chooses to engage our senses first. He has this small growing sound effect, a dum-dum-dum, coming in the distance. The words get bigger to show us the sound getting louder and louder until it's deafening. Here, the first panel is almost abstract, with a heavy use of these blur lines. Then, Yukimura pulls back, using half the page to show us these ships moving through the woods. This forces our eyes to slow down, and the composition invites us to look at the commander first, and then broaden our view to the immensity of these ships. Finally, there's this completely static panel with no motion effects at all, so it feels like it's happening in slow motion as the commander turns around to look at the ships. And once again, the next page starts with abstraction. Tons of blur and motion. We see and hear feet charging, but like the commander, we're still trying to piece together exactly what we're seeing. Then back to a static reaction shot, which is like a comma in this sentence that helps us shift our focus. Again, extreme motion as the ships pass by the commander. Then we have another panel of fast motion, too fast to grasp. Things are just flying past us. Another reaction shot, another comma. Then the commander's eyes and our eyes find focus. We see a man on the prow of the ship. He's clear, but all around him is blurred. 3 reaction shots. After all that speed and frenetic energy, here we have quiet. We have stillness. All across the battlefield, time has stopped. We're given a sense of just how many people will be affected by what we are about to see, even before we see it. And then the whole magnitude of the Vikings' plan to carry their ships through the woods into battle emerges now after pages of buildup. You could almost hear the soaring soundtrack in the background. All of that detail invites us to slow down, to pause. It's the comic equivalent of super slow motion. The only word to describe this approach to storytelling is epic. So let's talk about that word epic. When we look at the great Hollywood epics, we see a common element. They're these stories that are large but also small. They have plots that concern nations, that cover the sweep and scope of huge masses of humanity, but then frame those stories around individuals that show a deep concern with singular human beings. It's this method of zooming in and out on a period or moment in history that lets you grasp the whole of it so much better. Yukimura does the same thing, deftly darting around the battlefield, from these big moments to small personal ones. Let's take a look at another short sequence from this same opening battle to see how he does just that. This sequence couldn't be any more about the individual. We literally open with a perspective shot, the speed lines around the edges actually putting us inside Thorfinn as he charges forward. Everything compositionally works to force our eye towards the center of this panel. Even the arrows unnaturally point to one spot to really make it clear that this is the point of view of a character who's completely focused on his objective. Things move really fast here in these 2 small panels. We look down at the river, still moving ahead, and then I love this next shot. Yukimura has almost completely abandoned representational drawing entirely, instead using line and shape to try and convey speed and motion itself. Then finally, after 3 panels of speed, he gives us some slow motion to reveal what we've been experiencing. Thorfinn running to make this epic leap across the river. The eye trace is great here, right? As the composition quickly pulls our eyes right to Thorfinn at the top of the frame and then down to this area of high contrast where we can see the immense width of the river. But the little trick I love that makes this panel extra special is how Yukimura makes Thorfinn appear super fast. Thorfinn up here has these speed lines coming off of him. He's clearly in motion, but right in that second focal point is a soldier falling down, done in complete detail with no speed lines. It's as if time has frozen as Thorfinn leaps through the air. There's more to this sequence that we could keep analyzing, but I want to move on. Because if Vinland Saga were all just battles and fights, even as well done as these are, I don't think it would be a great manga. But what elevates it to the highest tiers of fiction is that these battles are not even the best part of the book. Sometimes I feel like I'm fighting a constant battle for control of my subscriptions. Like some kind of wallet-draining hydra, for every subscription I remember to cancel, 2 more seem to have sprung up in its place. My tendency to eagerly subscribe for subscription services and then promptly forget about them is taking a lot of money out of my pocket. Money I could be spending on long out-of-print graphic novels. Well, today's sponsor, Rocket Money, is here to help. With just a few taps in their app, I can find and then safely and securely cancel any unwanted subscriptions. Look, I'm genuinely serious about the importance of financial planning, which is why I'm happy to have Rocket Money as the sponsor for today's video. Beyond just canceling subscriptions, Rocket Money allows you to set a budget and helps you to stick to it by alerting you if you're going over in any of the categories you've set up. Finally, with Smart Savings, you can set an amount and a frequency, and Rocket Money will automatically put that money into a savings account for you. It's a really great way to get started with savings if you're new to it. So go to rocketmoney.com/Matt with 4 T's or click the link in the description to get started for free. You can also unlock even more features with premium. That's rocketmoney.com/MATTTT to get started for free. As I mentioned, Thorfinn is just our window into the broader Viking world, and that world is much more than just battles. Thorfinn witnesses the human side of the Viking world, as well as the political, scheming, and double-crossing side. And in many ways, these scenes of simple human interaction are the very core of the book. Now, normally when I think of talkie manga, I think about manga artists like Naoki Urasawa, who brings pages of dialogue to life with an incredible control over facial expressions, of body language, of expressive hand gestures. But Yukimura has a problem. Most of his characters are stoic tough guys, constantly hiding their feelings and emotions behind stern demeanors. So how do you present a bunch of stony-faced characters standing bolt upright, talking endlessly without slipping into monotony and boredom? How do you make this work in a visual medium? For this, Yukimura turns to his control of blocking and composition. I'll caveat this that this is an area where Yukimura does get better as the series goes on, but I'm trying to only pull scenes from the first arc to avoid spoilers, so we'll get into it. This chapter starts with this character, Askeladd, kneeling before the king. The visuals tell us right away the balance of power between these two characters. Not only does the blocking put Askeladd kneeling far below the king, but the framing of the shot puts Askeladd's head lower in the frame, so all the other characters tower over him. Our first close-up of the king shows him from below. His eyes cast down upon Askeladd and the reader, reinforcing his position of authority and control. We see Askeladd next from above, diminishing him further. On the following page, we see these neutral shots of reactions from the other characters, but Askeladd himself is shrinking panel by panel. By the final frame, he only comes up to the king's feet. Even without any movement or dialogue, you can tell the dynamic here. Jumping ahead a few pages, as Askeladd makes his case to the king, things change. Here, we finally look up at him from below. He grows larger in the frame. The visuals subtly reinforce the weight and power of his words. But, as the king considers his plea, he shrinks once more. Then, these detailed shots of the king slow time down. And now, in a dramatic moment of blocking, the king comes down the steps. The moment gets bigger as Yukimura uses the most extreme camera angles yet to show us the immense difference in power between these two men. But over the next 3 pages, the king invites Askeladd to rise, and they become equal-sized giants on this page, with the critical panel of this whole sequence showing them as mirror images, equal partners. The balance of power has shifted. And then, in one of the most striking visuals in the story so far, Yukimura spends a whole magnificent page on Askeladd's critical moment of decision, one of the most important in the story. It's played out as an extreme close-up with immense detail, the veins popping out of his head, and between these 2 panels, the decision is made. And how does Yukimura show us that? A simple, heavily zoomed-in shot of an eye looking to the side. Yukimura makes this moment, this single shot of an eye movement, feel as big and important as those Viking ships crashing through the forest. So if you don't know what that decision is, you'll have to go read the comic, because this is the end of the spoiler-free section of the video. So before we move on to the final point, let me show you these books, because Vinland Saga is available in either these compact and affordable 2-in-1 hardcovers, or these absolutely beautiful oversized 3-in-1 editions, which have thick paper and really vibrant printing. This set was actually sent to me by Walt's comic shop in Berlin, who specialize in selling English language comics and manga to customers across Europe. So if you're in Europe and watching this, please consider ordering from them. Not only do they have a great selection and ship their books with care, but they're giving viewers of this channel 10% off their first order with the code MATTTT. All links are down below. But now, for the rest of you, let's get into what's actually my favorite thing about this manga. We're gonna have to get into spoilers for about the first 75 chapters or so, because up to this point, Yukimura's been lying to you. See, Vinland Saga isn't about revenge at all. After 54 chapters of what might have been a very well done shonen battle epic, Yukimura does something crazy. He has another character unceremoniously kill the person Thorfinn was seeking revenge against. The chapter, fittingly titled The End of the Prologue, throws everything we know about this series into question. Thorfinn grieves, both for his own quest for revenge and for the man he wanted to kill. The next chapter is in many ways the first real chapter of Vinland Saga, as a broken and enslaved Thorfinn, stripped of all his cool gear and weaponry, wrestles with his own past. That's right, after 7 volumes of the bloodiest, most well-staged action to ever be put on paper, Yukimura forces us to wrestle with the consequences of all of that awesome violence. How insanely gutsy is it for an artist to not only dramatically change the direction of his work, but recontextualize and criticize everything he's spent the past 4 years serializing? Then finally, 71 chapters in, Thorfinn embarks on what will be his real quest, to avoid and try to create a world free from violence. I'd like to talk more about this, but I know YouTube's already going to be mad at me for telling a bunch of people to stop watching this video, so I'll keep it short and say that this ties into one of my favorite things about this manga. Yukimura allows his characters to grow. While so many manga, especially shonen manga, show us how an unbending protagonist changes the world around him, Vinland Saga does something extraordinary, and shows us how the world changes a person, and how that very growth will in turn reshape the world. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please let me know if you enjoyed this new series and any other series you'd like to see a deep dive on. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and check out the links below to pick up your copy of Vinland Saga if you don't already have one. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon.